Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Dangerous Rhetoric. This is episode 53. And today we are talking to Harrison Koehli. Harrison is an editor at Red Pill Press and co-host on the MindMatters Podcast. Welcome, Harrison. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes. Oh, and guys, remember, like, comment.
Hi, guys.
Oh, I always forget to do that.
All that stuff.
Like, comment, sub, and also check out MindMatters. You can find it on YouTube. Just search for MindMatters. Subscribe. It's a great show.
Yeah. Welcome, Harrison. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, guys. You can also, we're available on pretty much all the podcast platforms too. So you can search us on like iTunes and Buzzsprout, probably Stitcher, Podbean, whatever all of them are. We should be on most of them.
Yeah, we're on Spotify and all the other ones except for iTunes. They don't like us for some reason. I've applied multiple times, can't get it on there, but
I don't know.
It is what it is. So I wanted to ask you, Harrison, I saw, on Facebook that you guys are putting together a new edition of Political Ponerology, and I was hoping maybe you could just give our audience a brief explanation of Ponerology, its origin story.
Yeah, it's definitely a subject we have talked about on the show before, and we want to get someone on who knows it a little more in and out and is really familiar with that work. So.
Yeah, sure. So you guys are lucky. We like that. Aside from a few kind of obscure tweets and references on Facebook, we haven't actually announced it yet. So Michael Rechtenwald's writing the foreword, or he has written the foreword. So he pretty much spilled the beans, which was fine. Totally cool. So we
heard it here first, guys.
So yeah. So you get the exclusive audio visual announcement of the new edition of Ponerology. It was first published. Well, okay, a little bit of the background. It was written in 1984. Fittingly, nice year to be written in. Not only the year of my birth, but of course the year of George Orwell's famous novel, to which it is very relevant, and wasn't published. The author, Andrew Lobaczewski, couldn't get it published. Lobaczewski was a Polish psychologist who moved to the States in the late 70s, was pretty much forced to leave Poland because he was arrested for the third time, because he'd been living in Poland his whole life, and had some run-ins with the authorities for the work that he was doing. And so moved to New York in late 70s, wrote the book in 84, couldn't get it published, probably because of the subject matter, probably also just because it's a strange book. It came around in a time where I guess there wasn't a lot of mainstream political psychology going on. And so the political writers would say it was too political. The psychology writers would say, or the psychology writers would say it was too political. The political writers would say it was too psychological. Or
I never thought about it like that it would be looked at in that way and kind of create a division amongst scholars of whether or not this was a legitimate scholar work, if you have that much politics involved in it.
Yeah, well, there were also probably, those were at least the reasons given by the publishers that he submitted it to. So who knows how accurate those actually were, if they were just excuses. I mean, they could have just thought the book was too hard to read and were trying to be polite to him. Who knows? Because it was a difficult book to read and the translation was a bit clunky. But there could have also, and probably also, were ideological, like political reasons behind it, because the book is a revelation of the psychopathology of communism, essentially. So, well, we could speculate about the number of kind of left-leaning and even communist-leaning publishers or people in publishing at the time. But regardless, it wasn't published in 1985, when or afterwards when the translation was done, and that left it unpublished for the next 20 years or so, until 2005, when he got in touch with the editors of Saw.net and Red Pill Press, and passed over the manuscript. And so it was finally published in 2006 by Red Pill Press, the first edition. So we're doing a new edition now. What we've done is, with some Polish translators, we've gone through the Polish edition and just kind of meticulously compared the original English translation to the later Polish edition. So correcting some of the things that were kind of obscure, some of the things that were actually mistranslated or poorly translated. And for the Polish edition, which was published in 97, I believe, in Poland. He'd actually written a bunch more stuff and kind of like added just a few bits a few bits here and there, updating it and just adding new bits. So we've translated a lot of those and added those in either into the text or as footnotes. So the book itself, for any listeners or viewers who have read the first edition, it's a more accessible version because it's easier to read. It's got more information. I was the main editor, so I added like hundreds of footnotes, adding information like the latest research examples, because some of the times like Lobaczewski will just give a generalization or something, but won't give any background or any kind of concrete examples of what he's talking about. So I've added those in to help along, and written a new introduction giving more of the background of the book, more of the background of the kind of the period in which it was written and the context in which it was written, and then a bit of like the history of this kind of political psychology, which wasn't really there were several works done, over the past like 100 years, but here and there, and never really that popular, never really got to the level of pop psychology the way that psychopathy did in the 90s and 2000s with like works first with the works of Robert Hare. He wrote Without Conscience, a pop psychology book on psychopathy, really kind of reintroducing the concept for just regular readers. And then after that, like if you search psychopathy on Amazon, you'll just see dozens and dozens of books that have been published since then. So psychopathy's finally kind of entered into the more of the like mainstream worldview, and people kind of at least have more of an idea of what psychopathy is than they did in the 90s. Yeah. But along with that, in the last 10 years, like pretty much like the year after we published Ponerology, the first edition, there's a book called Evil Genes by Barbara Oakley that came out, where she was arguing some of the same points, and she hadn't read Ponerology. So this is the connection between like what people would generally consider like evil politicians, evil leaders, dictators and authoritarians, and psychopathology, personality disorders, but not just that, the link between just politics in general and personality types. So the prevalence of, and perhaps the increased prevalence of, narcissism, psychopathy, Machiavellianism in people who go into politics. So this was one of, like Lobaczewski wasn't the only person to say it, but he was one of the first, and he was the first to say it. Well, let's put it this way, just like a lot of scientific discoveries, he was one of several people that kind of noticed the same thing. None of them got very popular. No one really knew about them, like Gustav Gilbert, who was one of the allied psychologists at Nuremberg. He wrote a book called The Psychology of Dictatorship in 1950, where he made some of the same observations. He basically diagnosed Goering as a psychopath, and Huss, Rudolf Huss, the commandant at Auschwitz, as a schizoid personality. And so he'd made this connection between the noticeable or the recognizable personality disorders that were recognized at the time, and like totalitarian leaders and people involved in the totalitarian system. But that book was never republished. No one knows about it anymore. You can still find Gilbert's Nuremberg diaries, where he writes about his interactions with the defendants at Nuremberg, but you can't find his book Psychology of Dictatorship anywhere. And so he was one of the very few that actually saw this. And Lobaczewski and his colleagues in Poland and in the rest of Eastern Europe didn't have access to any of these books. So they kind of learned these things on their own and came to the same conclusions about the communist system. So not necessarily about Nazi Germany, but about the communist system in the 50s and 60s.
So they were basically,
and so
they were making the same observations at different time periods in different places without even realizing it. But Lobaczewski's whole thing is he thought the focus on the question of evil came too much from the mystical, religious, theological, philosophical perspective, and that when we think about the question of evil, we always kind of go back to that lens to look at it. And he felt, well, what we're lacking here is a scientific perspective of how to classify what is evil and where does it come from, right? And that's what Ponerology means. It's the study of evil. And before him, and who is it you're mentioning? Goering? Was that his name, Goering?
Well, the writer was Gilbert.
Gilbert, yeah. So before them, it's like this wasn't really a way to approach that question. You know, typically that was left to as a theological matter. It wasn't something that typically scientists were looking at in that way.
And for people that aren't totally familiar, and I never understood why people say, why it's like called psychopathy when I always say psychopathy, but when we say psychopath, but people that, if you're not familiar with that term, that's basically means somebody who is born without a conscience, with a very narrow range of emotional expression. They're violent, aggressive, manipulative, the kind of extreme end of the cluster B personality disorders, you know, they kind of the antisocial disorders. When you're a psychopath, that's as antisocial as you can get. It's similar to the sociopath, but although sociopaths tend to be made, not born, at least that's the distinction in the language that I've been operating with for years.
Yeah, well, but in the field, there's definitely, those terms tend to be used interchangeably. Like I know if you read like The Sociopath Next Door by Martha Stout, she addresses that in the book as well, that when she uses the term sociopath, she actually is kind of talking about what we're talking about. Yeah. So terminology, you know, and I think
so there are terminology.
It's one of the things too, I think, that makes Lobaczewski's work difficult for people to grasp, is there's a lot of jargon,
a lot of vocab.
Yeah, so that's one of the things I try to clarify in the book with the footnotes and with the introduction, is to try to get his terms clear, because a lot of the words he uses are basically, he's operating from a system of psychiatry and psychology that was used in the, you know, in the 40s and 50s, and he's using that vocabulary. And in some ways, I think it's actually better than the vocabulary that was used in the West, like with the DSM, well, at least in America, better than that in certain regards, and in many ways. The field is kind of moving more in the direction that Lobaczewski was going in the sense that, like, Lobaczewski identified several pathways that lead to what we would call personality disorders, and he distinguished different types of personality disorders based on what their cause was. So this was the kind of the tradition, the scientific tradition in which he was brought up, and that is, if you're essentially classifying. So if you're essentially born with it, if it's something that seems genetic or inherited, then he would consider that a psychopathy. So we'd probably consider like a lot of personality disorders to be inherited, or to be like temperamental, to be genetic, or somehow deeply rooted with the development of an individual. And well, there's even questions about that, but as just a rough framework, that's what he went with. And so if someone acquired personality changes through brain damage, and that brain damage could come through blunt trauma to the head, often and more severely as a child or as an infant, that there can be birth complications, or even pregnancy complications, like lack of oxygen, or exposure to certain chemicals or substances or hormones, like too much or too less, too little. And so he distinguished between like inherited and acquired forms. And then the third one was kind of the social influences. Like if you're a child raised by a parent or two parents who have personality disorders, he'd consider that a third. He used sociopathy for that one. So psychopathy was genetic. Characteropathy was acquired biologically through some kind of trauma to the brain.
Yeah, that was
sociopathy was acquired through.
That was the word I was trying to.
Characteropathy. So
yeah. It's one of
and so there's an approach now.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm forgetting we have that.
Right. There's a slight delay.
But it's one of those words that he used that were very specific to his work, that you don't really encounter terminology like that outside of Lobaczewski's work. I had never heard the term characteropathy before I read that book.
Yeah, and that was a term coined by another Polish psychologist. So understandably, so that kind of gets carried over into the translation. But there's a new approach now that's gaining prominence. It's pretty popular. It's called I don't know I can't remember the order of the words, but something like socio-biological perspective, and that way of looking at it identifies all of the kind of risk factors for psychopathology. So you've got the psychological, genetic factors, the biological insult, like trauma factors, and then the economic or just social factors, and you can have risk factors in all of them. So like the worst is if you have all three. So if you're born with a susceptible like template from your genetics, and then you have maternal neglect, so you have a poor mother, for instance, or not a very good mother, and then you have like poverty, and you grow up in an area where there's like lots of violence and lots of crime, that's kind of a perfect recipe for producing like a totally, well, for a severely antisocial personality, right? Or the most violent, most kind of like, the most violent kinds of
most
common criminal type psychopathy.
Yeah. So
but if you don't have,
the way I think of it is like, if you have a psychopath who's raised, say, in the ghetto amongst, drug violence and gang violence and that sort of thing, their parents and all that stuff, yeah, you're going to get a more aggressive, like gang leader type psychopath. Whereas, you could have one that might not have that factor. Maybe they were raised by perfectly good parents who provided every opportunity, did everything they could to try to establish that parent-child bond, which I believe is discussed in Without Conscience by Robert Hare. He talks about that, in some of the cases they found that these people, it's not that they didn't have the neglectful parents. The parents tried to establish that bond. There was something in the child inherently that was preventing the child-parent bond from taking place. So that is more like the genetic type of psychopath. It clearly indicates something where there's something in the nature of the being of the child, and it's necessarily something apparent. But what does happen with someone who's born like that is the environment or the nurture determines the type of psychopath you get. So you could get a coercive, charming one who had all the opportunities given to them, and maybe they end up as a politician or some
Joe Biden,
but they don't have to use force in those types of things, or they just know to not use that to get their way. They'll do it, another way. They probably even have good educations. Then you can have ones who are born into more destitute situations. They got beat, they got, abused, all that stuff, and they become the violent type, the aggressive ones.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Sometimes I think some people would consider that a controversial view, because a lot of people don't like my perspective is, I think a lot of people just don't like the idea that anyone can be born bad, there's a bad seed. And so
I think that comes with having a conscience. I think, when you have a conscience, you naturally, want to believe everyone is like you. You want to believe that there is a little bit of good in everyone. Who doesn't want to believe that? Who doesn't want to believe that there's something redeemable in Adolf Hitler? There's something redeemable in Stalin. We want to believe that because we want to believe that like these people can be helped, that we can change them. But maybe that is not the case. And maybe that's one of the reasons we continue to be subject to the will and destruction of people like this, is because we want to believe that so badly about them.
Yeah. Well, I do think that just from a strictly scientific perspective, I think it's a fine assumption for researchers to have if it inspires them to look deeply into like root causes, because it could be that like some of the researchers do consider psychopathy to be a neurodevelopmental issue, so that it who knows, there could be some kind of like infant interventions that could be done to kind of prevent the further development of psychopathy, because it's not the case, at least from the studies that are available, it's not the case that if there's identical twins, for instance, that both of them will be psychopaths. You'd think that would be the case, but it hasn't been totally demonstrated yet. So we can't say that it's 100% inherited, and that it's just like from conception until adulthood, that's just a definite path that an individual is going to be on. I mean, it could be the case, who knows, with more research they might discover that, but it does seem to be the case that it's like 50% genetic, 50% environmental, whatever that means. And but even if you take that as kind of a methodological starting point, at least from a research perspective, that doesn't mean that an adult psychopath can change.
Yes,
because even if there's some kind of window of opportunity in like either pregnancy, like in utero, or as an infant or as a child, when you've got an adult psychopath, all evidence is they're not going to change. You can't change their basic psychological structure. Right. And so with that in mind, that kind of will determine how you're going to deal with them.
Yeah, and without conscience, I also recall the section where he talked about the increased rate of recidivism that they observed in the very psychopathic inmates that they tried to reform, and they kind of found that the more they tried to reform them,
they made them better.
Yeah, well,
better psychopaths.
The more they actually ended up just
more effective
the
manipulators.
more likely they were to just end up back in prison anyway and doing something crazy after, recidivism. So it is interesting. It definitely raises a lot of questions, but I think what you bring up about like the very, very early type of interventions, that I think is where the research should certainly start to look, and like maybe if there's a way to like mitigate the damage of this sort of thing on society. That is, which brings me to one of the points that I wanted to address is, Lobaczewski, he was looking at this subject in a different way than even still a lot of the scholars today are. Most of them are still, I think, looking at the personal, individual ways that psychopathy and psychopathy and things like that affect us in like our personal lives. He was looking at something that we call macro social evil. This was what he coined it. And he was looking at the larger scale of how a person like this could end up in a higher position in society of power, and that when they do, the damage they're able to do is substantially worse and way disproportionate compared to the amount of these types of people actually exist in the world.
Yeah, I'll get back to something that we were talking about just a bit earlier about the nature of evil. So you guys mentioned that Lobaczewski's kind of one of his implicit points is that the way we've been looking at evil hasn't been appropriate to what it actually is. And obviously, because we haven't eliminated evil, it's obviously we don't understand it. But his approach is, he argues that moral evil, like what people just generally think of when they think about evil, which is, I'd say, if we take it out of the metaphysical realm, out of religion, about some kind of like evil force or evil like demonology or something like that, or the idea of Satan or something specifically religious like that. If we just eliminate that, because that's what he does as a scientist, even though he's a Christian, he looks at, okay, well, what does human evil look like? And that's pretty much the like intentional harm that people do to each other. This can range from like emotional abuse to slander, to lying about a person, to physical violence, to like deadly to murder, to sexual abuse of children. Like these are the things that we generally consider evil in our everyday lives. And so he argues that there's a tight link, like if you imagine a Venn diagram that's almost completely, two circles are almost identical, that what we consider moral evil is intimately linked with what he calls psychobiological evil. That the things that we consider evil are intimately linked with psychopathology. So he gives the example of, from his practice, he gives the like in his career as a psychologist working in various institutions, hospitals, working as a industrial psychologist, that out of the like 5,000 patients that he worked with, that the vast majority, like 90%, 90-something%, he could identify of people who he could identify as committing some kind of evil, like the types I just mentioned, also had an identifiable psychopathology associated with that. And those would go back to the things, the three kind of pathways that I mentioned. They were either psychopaths, characteropaths, or just people with personality disorders, or sociopaths. Just, well, I guess the overall term would be people with personality disturbance or personality disorders. And so, well, for listeners who aren't familiar with personality disorders, I should have said something about that early on. Those are the ones the ones we recognize in the West are things like, there's the cluster Bs. You guys had Josh Slocum on for a show, so he probably talked about this. So the cluster Bs, like narcissistic, borderline, antisocial, personality disorders. Is there another one? Well, but then there's also like schizoid personality disorder.
Yes.
Schizoid, like dependent, paranoid. So that there's there's something, I think there's like 10 personality disorders that are recognized in Western psychiatry, but that's just kind of one way of classifying them. There are different ways, including a personality-based one that's more based on the big 5 personality traits, but we don't have to get into that unless you guys want to. And so there's this issue of evil, this kind of overlap of psychobiology and morality and the things we consider evil. And so one of the main points that he makes in regards to that is that the dynamics, those interpersonal dynamics, or I wouldn't even say that, just the dynamics are the same no matter the scale. So it can be on the interpersonal level, it can be on the small group level, or it can be on the, like what you said, what he calls the macro social level. This is the level of an entire nation or country or empire. And so when he's talking about communism, he rarely refers to it as communism. He refers to it as a macro-social pathological phenomenon, as a social disease, because what he observed and what he and his colleagues observed was that the way he described it, I think this was in an interview. He said that he was asked about there's this one principle that he uses because of that phenomenon, that the dynamics are the same no matter what level that you're on. Then he argues in the book that in order to get an idea of what's going on in the Kremlin, for instance, in the USSR, you can study a small village in like an outpost or like one of the Eastern Bloc countries like Poland. You can go to a small village, understand the dynamics of what's going on in that village, and get a pretty good idea of how things are operating in the Kremlin, because the system, like a fractal, replicates itself on every level. And the thing he observed about the village that he was studying at the time, or working in at the time and studying at the same time, was that all of the psychopaths in the community were like on the central committee or whatever the top like political communist committee was. That's where all the psychopaths were. You didn't have all the psychopaths like you have in a more normal society, which have their own problems, where you'll have some psychopaths in positions of influence and power. You'll have some psychopaths. Well, they're just distributed throughout the population. You'll have like the low-level criminals. You'll have if you look at the States,
the disease that infects starts to lift those types of people toward the top, but also it's those types of people gravitate towards positions that give them like authority or control or their ability to manipulate other people. Because the psychopath or the disturbed type person, one of the things we didn't talk about is like how they view others who aren't like them as a resource, in a sense, as a thing, as a means to an end. They don't necessarily view us as beings. We're almost more like objects.
Well, and also one of the key traits is that they sort of derive pleasure from causing other humans to suffer. And that's the key distinction, really, in my mind, from the people that have these disturbances versus people that have, a functioning conscience or a potential for conscience, is that we derive joy from the joy of others. Well, that's the normal model. Whereas these particular individuals, they only feel pleasure when they inflict suffering on the people around them.
Yeah, and so the term for that is sadism. So there's an overlap, with personality traits. So you'll find you won't like. I'd say that I'm not familiar with the research on this, in depth, but I think sadism, there's probably a spectrum of sadism. So you'll find some people who aren't psychopaths who have a sadistic streak to them or elements. Well, I think this is the thing about a lot of psychopathy or psychopathology in general, is that most of the traits that you'll find in psychopathology are normal human traits that are taken to extremes, or that get taken to extremes by the exclusion of other traits. So you take away any ability for conscience in a psychopath, and you're going to have certain tendencies that are kind of latent in humanity, I think, that become kind of supreme in the psychopathic personality, because I think everyone has experienced, like, I don't know how to pronounce it, Schadenfreude, when one of your enemies, something bad happens to them, or, someone burns them really bad, and you just feel a little bit of pleasure at seeing them suffer. And I think that's a pretty normal form of sadism. But with a sadistic psychopath, it's literally the kind of like horror movie stuff or serial killer stuff, where they actually The weirdest and most kind of extreme form for me, at least, is the sexual sadists, like violent sexual sadists who literally get off on like brutal violence. And
there's a book
that's something
that, right now. I can't remember the authors, but it's 3 authors, and it's actually they were the characters in that Netflix series. I'm trying to remember the name of it.
Mindhunter.
Mindhunter.
So they wrote a book. They're the ones who actually kind of really studied those types specifically in depth. But they wrote a book called Sexual Homicide, which is all about classifying those types, the people who like get sexual arousal out of chopping other people up and weird
Dahmer,
things like
Bundy,
that. And what's weird is like not all of them even like do penetrative things and stuff like that, but it's just strange. There is definitely a whole like weird spectrum to the sadism, and yeah, that is the most extreme form of it. And people who, like I said earlier, who have a conscience and want to believe there's a little bit of good in everyone, when you're confronted with stuff like that, it is extremely difficult to still have that belief when you know that those types of folks are out there and the things that they are capable of doing to other humans really makes you question that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's another book by probably one of those 3 authors. What's it called? Something like we hunt monsters, or how we hunt monsters, or something like that. And he was one of those FBI profiler guys, and so he talks about that too.
So Robert A. Ressler, Ann Burgess, and John Douglas. They were the 3. And
the first guy.
Yeah, those 3 main characters in the Mindhunter series, that's who they're based on, is these 3. But yeah, creepy stuff, not fun stuff to learn about, that's for sure. But necessary.
Well, one of on my show Mind Matters on YouTube, at least, one of the most popular shows we did was on Israel Keys, a more modern serial killer. Early 2000s is, I believe, when he got caught, or was it 2012? It might have been early 2010s actually when he got caught. And so we read a book on him and did a show on the book. And then I found this podcast called True Crime Bullshit. And the guy that does it is Josh, I can't remember his last name, but if you search True Crime Bullshit and Josh, he's got a podcast where he's done, I think there's been like 4 or 5 seasons, and all except one of them have been on Israel Keys. And so if you want to like if you like true crime, or if you're interested in serial killers, I'd really
It's Josh Hallmark.
Hallmark, yeah. It's a great show because he himself is a great investigator. So he's put in hundreds and hundreds of hours, probably thousands of hours, investigating this case, trying to find other victims that haven't been identified, and a lot of background. You hear he includes recordings from the FBI interrogations of Keys, and interviews, all kinds of stuff. So I'd recommend that one for listeners who are interested in true crime or serial killers or psychopathy, because Israel Keys was a really interesting case study in a psychopathic serial killer. And so you can see the images he presents, you can see the way he talks, and then you see what he was doing, when he's alone and hunting.
I think this is a good springboard into another subject I kind of wanted to address, is the misconceptions people have about psychopaths because of these types, the aggressive ones, the killers, those types. And, for a long time, I guess this is kind of going away now, because you talked about earlier, there's definitely more of an interest in the subject that's arising, and more people seem to be talking about it, more books are coming out, more articles. But it's this misconception that, when you think of a psychopath, that's what people think of. They think of the aggressive serial killer types. And the detriment to that is they don't understand that the majority of them probably aren't like that. They operate on the shady side of the law, which was how Robert Hare put it. And even the flaw in his own work, which he addressed, is that what he was studying was a portion of the prison population who are the failed psychopaths. Those are the ones who got caught, and one of the things that we don't know is about how many there are is because a lot of them don't get caught. They don't technically break the law. A psychopath doesn't have to beat you up or kill you. They could I don't know, like meet you at a pub and then form a personality that they think you're going to like, and then start dating you for a year. And then next thing you know, like your bank account is empty and they disappear from your life, you know, something like that. Equally without conscience, just not something that's violent or aggressive. And I think people need to really understand that that misconception kind of clouds our judgment and clouds our ability to really see the full complexity of the issue, and probably makes us more open to being manipulated by these types of people, because we assume we're going to see someone aggressive immediately, but they can be charming.
Yeah, well, the weird thing about that, I agree with everything you said, but there's a weird thing about that is that people assume that, oh, a psychopath must be a serial killer, like somehow the two are equivalent. But you know, very few psychopaths are serial killers. Like serial killers are an extremely rare breed, but no one knows a person's a serial killer until they get caught. So this is the thing. This is where the comparison is actually apt, because serial killers are expert, even the so-called fail ones, the ones that get caught. Well, the only reason they're considered serial killers is because they didn't get caught for the entire period of their career, right? So they were successful until they got caught. And you look at like Ted Bundy or Israel Keys, and no one suspected a thing. They might have thought they were weird. They might have revealed a little weird thing here and there. People might have had questions about them, but no one guessed that they were serial killers. Like these people, serial killers and psychopaths in general, they can skirt by. They can totally fool you. Even the totally crazy ones.
Yeah, they blend.
Yeah, they're chameleons. They're social chameleons.
They blend in. I remember, you know, the description in Without Conscience too, where he talks about, I think it was a scene in a movie. I forgot what movie it is, but like she's looking into the mirror and then is trying to play act emotions, you know. And this is another interesting thing about that is, you know, how self-aware are psychopaths, and, you know, do all of them get to this point where they might start to actually realize, hey, there's something fundamentally different about me than the rest of people. I should be crying right now at this funeral, but I'm not. And how many of them are aware of that and just know to play act the emotion so as to blend into the social situation?
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting thing. I can't remember that was Robert Hare that wrote about that. He might have talked about it in a documentary. I can't remember the actress. It was a blonde actress. And it was a true crime movie from the 90s, but I can't remember which one.
Either.
Yeah. And so she was like at a car accident and watching the like, I think it was like the mother of the child that died in the car accident, and watching her facial expressions, and then going home in front of the mirror and practicing those facial expressions. And that's actually kind of common for a lot of, not just psychopathy, but common to a certain degree amongst a number of like mental disorders, like even in autism, where the inability to understand social cues and social interactions, and then kind of having to teach them, it's schizophrenia too, kind of having to teach them to yourself based on this like strict rule-based thing. Okay, in this situation, this is the normal thing to do. And with psychopathy, it's just a lot creepier, because it is this weird kind of chameleon thing, like you were saying. And one of I read a book, one of the latest kind of scientific books on psychopathy, called Understanding Psychopathy by, I believe his name's Chris Thompson, something like that. And it's just a summary of all the latest research. And so he talks about a bit about this, and the kind of summarizes, I can't remember if it was his idea or if he's just summarizing the possible explanations for this, but the way of kind of looking at it is that if you understand psychopathy as this developmental problem from early childhood, then from an early age, then kids can't psychopathic children can't understand these social cues. So their entire socialization period, like, you know, from infancy, they've been learning this, they've been observing this, because they can't react with the normal human reactions. So by the time you get an adult, you get like an expert manipulator who has for their entire life been like trained by virtue of their own psychology to act these things out. they essentially they're actors who have been trained, from infancy to be expert actors.
Which
well, maybe that says something about Hollywood too.
That was what I was about to say. I'm like, this kind of raises a question of, how many actors and
Alec Baldwin,
Kevin Spacey, how many actors and people who gravitate towards that position are actually just psychopaths, and they're just really good at play acting emotions. You have to wonder.
That would be an interesting research project.
And then you think about like House of Cards, and you're like, no wonder you played that character so well. It's like, that's maybe who you've been this whole time. It definitely makes you wonder. But yeah, like, to me, that has always been one of the creepiest things about it, is this idea that they kind of blend in. But not just that, like I mentioned earlier, like how many of them get to a point, I think, of like self-awareness that they are fundamentally different, meaning where they start to realize this. And not just that, how many of them begin to view themselves as superior to other beings because of that. And this is something I've thought about before too, and you see it typically in like the comic book villain or in movies, where they have that approach where they're just like, well, you're weak. You can't do what I can do to keep power and to get power, and you're too weak. Your pitiful little emotions hold you back from doing the things necessary to become great and powerful. And so that this maybe riff on that a bit. And
oh yeah, my mind was wandering a bit, but so the psychopathic mentality, it's pretty much the way psychopaths tend to look at the world, and this, you can find this in Hare's book, also in Thompson's book, is it's kind of the total adoption and acceptance of this dog-eat-dog world, or the law of the jungle. So there's this complete self-centered nature, where for the psychopath, it's narcissistic. This kind of like essential narcissism, where I deserve everything. So when it comes to property, for instance, I want that, I deserve it, therefore it is right for me to take it from you, and I'm justified from taking it from you because I can. And there's probably better ways of putting it, but that's kind of essentially it, is that like Brent, like you were saying, I think it was Brent, that psychopaths see other people as objects, or maybe it was you, Daniel, as objects, as tools, as a resource, as a resource, as you put it. And so, and as a resource that is mine to exploit. And so this is kind of the mentality that Samanov talks about in The Criminal Mind, Inside the Criminal Mind. It's this idea that, well, I deserve it. So when I take something from someone else, I deserve it, and you deserve it. You deserve for me to take it from you because you're weak. I am superior to all you lowly beings. And so Lobaczewski argues that's a common feature among psychopaths, is that this kind of superiority that they feel to regular humans. So all these other people that have these it's hard to get inside the mind of a psychopath, but we're talking about like the observing of other people's emotions, for instance. So a psychopath on some level is going to be aware that other people, they cry when you punch them, or when you shoot them, or when you stab them, or they scream. It's like, so they realize that other people have these reactions that they don't have, but because they can't feel them, they can't really make the leap that there's actually something behind those feelings. It's just this kind of biological reaction that other people seem to have for some reason. And so there's a disconnect there. But what was my point in bringing that up? Well, relating that to like the psychopathic worldview. So when you're looking at all these other people, they tend to behave in these strange ways that are incomprehensible to the psychopath. These are the things that we consider just being a normal human. So when you see people interact, there's kind of like, there's a give and take. There's a trust often in relationships and interactions.
I remember
and that's just totally foreign.
It was Hare who used, I think it was the analogy of colorblind in describing emotions.
That was Lobaczewski.
And to the psychopath, he described them as being colorblind. Imagine someone approaches a red light and you know, they don't know the light is red. They just know where the red light is. And they know based on its position that means go or that means stop, but they don't actually know what red looks like or what yellow looks like or what green looks like. And he sort of uses that analogy to describe how emotions are to the psychopath. You know, they can like identify them when they see them based on the reaction, but they don't actually know what that is like experientially. They don't get it.
Mm-hmm. Right, and that's something that Lobaczewski gets into. There's like, it's deep, because for normal people, like the vast majority of people, they grow up, well, how to put it, our emotional nature is kind of implicit. It's so foundational to our personalities and the way we interact with the world that we don't notice it. So we don't notice that there are things underlying our social interactions with each other. It's very hard to notice those things. I mean, you can notice them if you look for them and if you're aware that they're there. But there are certain kind of implicit things going on in just regular everyday human interactions. And so this is probably one of the reasons that psychopathy is so hard for a lot of people to understand, is because it is so foreign, because that basic substructure of the human personality and human sociality is missing in psychopaths.
Goes the other way too.
So
in their own inability to understand us. It's like there's a wall there,
right?
You know.
Mm-hmm. So I think probably normal humans have a better chance of understanding psychopaths than psychopaths have of understanding normal humans, because you can like think in terms of what would it be called, like a process of negation or elimination. It's like we can imagine removing certain things about normal human nature and maybe come to some approximation of what it must be like to be a psychopath, but you can't add anything on for that, you know, that can't add anything when it's not there in the first place. So psychopaths have no possibility of even imagining what it's like to just feel like normal human emotions in a normal relationship. It's just like that person is just meat, a thing to be used and thrown out when they're, you know, when it's convenient. But and there's no guilt, no remorse.
And as someone who has a conscience, we can understand what it's like to not feel too, you know, or at least to become numb to something, to turn it off. And I often describe it as like a mechanism that can be turned on and off, right? And that's how you see the ponerological process is, you know, a psychopath gets in power and then they get a lot of people to turn theirs off. And where the psychopath just does not have that mechanism, it's just simply not there. But by us having the full range of human emotions, we can still understand aggression or hunger, or, you know, those basic sort of primal drives that the psychopath does have. But we have the other stuff, they don't have it. Like you said, it's like for us, it's a process of elimination. We can imagine what it's like to like not care about people maybe, or to you know, eliminate joy and happiness or whatever from, you know, seeing someone else be joyful and happy. But the psychopath can't imagine what it's like to have those things.
Yeah. And that actually gets to something I've been thinking about recently, and we talked a bit about it on the show that we did on the managerial revolution, because we were talking about Michael McConkey's work. McConkey's a guy who's read Ponerology, and he's been writing about it lately, and so he's talking about this idea of the managerial revolution. This kind of over the past 150, 100 plus years, that authors like James Burnham have made the point in like the 40s that there was a new revolution going on in the West, and it was the managerial revolution. It was a new class that was kind of taking political power, and that nowadays, so the argument is that was successful, that nowadays that is the ruling class today is the managerial type. It's not the military, it's not the nobles, you know, the aristocrats, it's not the capitalists, like the property owners. It's the managers. The managers have taken over essentially, and have for decades. And so he made the point that that there's, I don't know if he used this phrase, but that there's almost a functional psychopathy among the managerial class, because one of the things about a managerial type is their kind of facility with language manipulation. So you don't have to be a psychopath to be a PR man. You don't have to be a psychopath to be a PR spokesman. You just have to read the script, right? And have the ability to have your answers ready. Okay, when they ask about this, this is our party line. These are the answers that you give. And so you can be a normal human and you can do that. Maybe with some, more or less or greater or lesser pangs of conscience. You might feel bad about it. Maybe you won't, because that's just the culture that you've been, encultured into. So you have this kind of pseudo-psychopathic mentality that is endemic among the ruling class, and it could be a large majority of normal people in the ruling class. But the problem is that because you are acting like a psychopath, that makes it that much easier for psychopaths to gain entry into that position, and it makes it that much more attractive for psychopaths to gain entry into that position.
Snakes and Suits, I think, is a book that definitely focuses more on those types of people, like the psychopath in the workplace, I think is the subtitle to that book. And that was another one by Robert Hare, but he co-wrote that one. I think it was
Paul Babiak.
Yeah. And that's a great book for anyone, listening to definitely check out if you want to understand more of this side of it, like the managerial corporate type of psychopath. And like you said, like that environment seems to not just attract those types, but those types do better in that environment, which is why it attracts them.
Yeah. It's easier for them. And this is one of the most interesting or most important points in ponerology when we're applying this to history and to modern history, to politics, is he gives a kind of progression of how this happens in politics. And it might be a simplified version because he acknowledges even in the book that he was writing, or he started researching this in the 50s when the communist system was kind of imposed on Poland and had been in existence for the previous 30 plus years, or let's say 30 years. So in the USSR, for instance, that the system had 30 years to develop and refine itself. And so he kind of came in and started researching it at a fairly advanced stage. So he acknowledges that the early stages of the development of this macrosocial disease, he had to kind of I wouldn't say guess, but he had to infer the dynamics that were going on in those early stages by reading history, probably by, talking to his elders and trying to figure out what happened in those early years. So we can't have so there's probably some question or there's room for refinement on on the early stages of this process. But the picture that he painted, the progression that he laid out was that it tends to happen like this, and it tended to happen like this, like in the 1800s and the early 1900s, that you have an incompetent leader, often perhaps with a form of brain damage that basically messes with their facilities. It could also be senility, but various mental problems, put it that way.
I'm just
when that happens,
thinking about our current head chief. Oh God.
Well, so what happens in that situation? Well, okay, so now you've got incompetence at the highest levels. And the way this tended to happen was that what happens when you have an incompetent leader? Well, they tend to be this is what he argues, tend to be then surrounded by kind of sycophants, and they end up making poor decisions. And when people start getting upset with these poor decisions, maybe it might be poor military decisions or just poor foreign relations, poor international, poor foreign policy, poor domestic policy. People start getting upset. Well, then you've got the situation where the top is the person at the top is incompetent, and then you've got this growing resentment, and you get essentially a protest movement or an opposition movement that gains legitimacy to some degree or popularity, and then that requires the clamping down of that opposition because the ruling power wants to stay in power. And when you have that, then you have the requirement for people to do the oppressing or the repressing, and that makes the people that are more suited to do the repressing are the people with more personality disorders. And then you have the people who are more suited to lying and scheming within the inner circle who gain power in politics. And so this develops a situation where the people at the top, the kind of the upper echelons of the ruling class become more and more saturated by personality disordered people, and the opposition too becomes more and more saturated by personality disordered people. And then it's just a matter of which one's going to win. And you can have a pathocracy that develops all the way from the top, the steady progression of a like the infection of an existing power structure, or you can have a revolution from below, like the Russian Revolution, where a pathological opposition gains power and then institutes a pathocracy and totally wipes out all of the people that were in the previous ruling class. And so there's this kind of this weakening of, how did he put it in one, I think this is in an unpublished bit or one of his other writings, where he describes it as authoritative rule descends to authoritarian rule, which then becomes pathocratic rule. So you have this progression of them, just like it's how poor leadership and other factors too. We haven't talked about the hysteria, mass hysteria, how all these factors kind of contribute to just the decay of an existing society or social structure or political structure. And that decay is like, it's like sweet smelling food or fragrance, for psychopaths to move in and just take over.
So would you say we are living through such a time period right
sounds
now?
Very familiar.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I kind of go back and forth on how to interpret everything that's going on, because there are a number, like I see advantages to looking at things in a variety of different ways. So I don't want to say I don't want to say with any degree of certainty what's going on, but I can offer some options, some different things. So there are some people that argue, like people either familiar with Ponerology or not familiar with Ponerology, that all politics is the same everywhere, that it's always psychopaths in power, no matter what your system, like no matter what. Now, I can see the advantage and even I think the motivation for seeing that, because I think there's a degree of truth to it. But at the same time, I'm not sure that it's totally true. I think there's more going on than that. But that's a huge question. So that there's another option, is that perhaps there's a degree let's just say you could take the average of all human societies. I think that you could make the argument that there's going to be a higher proportion of psychopaths than in any other like sphere, perhaps. Well, except for perhaps for some like gang leaders or something, where that's pretty much like almost 100% or something like that, or at least a lot higher, not 100%. But that what Lobaczewski's talking about when he's talking about pathocracy is a very specific type of like social structure. And so what I see going on is that there is, let's say, a lot of psychopathology in like society and in our politics. But I think that we haven't yet approached the degree of what Lobaczewski would classify as a pathocracy. But I think we're definitely going in that direction. You could even make the argument that by virtue of the fact that there is this degree of psychopathology going on, that it's some kind of pathocracy, or perhaps at a developing stage of pathocracy. But what Lobaczewski's talking about is when what you could call the entire psychopathic subset of a population becomes the ruling class, which as far as I know hasn't happened yet. I can't see that happening. There are still several, there are millions of psychopaths that are still in prisons, millions of psychopaths that still aren't in politics. What he observed, now this is a question, this is an empirical question, was he right or not? I don't know, I can't verify it, but I tend to trust him. I tend to think he was probably pretty close to correct, is that like in that example of the village that he was studying, all of the psychopaths in that village were top committee members in the local government. and that replicated itself no matter what village you were in, no matter what city you were in, no matter what province you were in, no matter what country or major region you were in. There's a book called Substate Dictatorship, an academic book that kind of gets into this from a political science, like sociology point of view, not from a technological. Substate Dictatorship by, can't remember his first name. His last name's Khlevniuk. He's a Russian, Ukrainian, I think like Ukrainian Russian, but he lives in Russia, academic on like on Soviet Union in like he's written a biography of Stalin and he did that. He co-authored that one. But that's like a look at,
man, I can't say these names. And
Gorlitsky, I think.
Khlevniuk, man, I can't say these Russian names.
Yeah, Khlevniuk.
Yeah, like noting all of these books because I'm like, I want to check these out later.
Well, that one kind of just looks at it like the political structure and how basically how one way of looking at that fractal structure that I was talking about how the system kind of replicated itself on every level. And that's probably, probably normal in any kind of social structure. But when you have one that's dominated by psychopaths, then it's going to have certain flavor to it and, certain characteristics that probably aren't present in other political systems. But I'd say probably the biggest danger is that things continue to get worse, or that the optimistic thing would be to say that there are existing social norms and structures that would prevent the full-blown development of a pathocracy. But that doesn't mean that we won't be, in various countries in the West, saddled with a kind of like hybrid pathocracy for who knows how many years to come, where it's just like, they won't go that far. They won't totally replicate like the absolute totalitarian control on every level, or maybe they'll just be able to do it without that social structure in place, with like what everyone's afraid of with like the Great Reset, and with what can be done with digital currencies, and the ability to just lock people, like totally control people's monetary transactions, and with like a kind of Black Mirror social credit type system. Like you can imagine some pretty dark shit that could go down without having to totally restructure the like the social order. And but who knows, by virtue of doing those things, it can create it.
It's because of our technology too. I think that's why the methods are changed. They don't have to like round people up or do it in necessarily that way anymore. It's like now we have, most people have a personal computer on them at all times. So it's a different playing field now. And I think a lot of what's happening is definitely more like psychological war than anything.
It also reminds me of viruses, because viruses, like, well, they come up to a cell, they connect, then they inject their DNA, their genetic material into the cell, and they hijack the cell. And very quickly, the cell becomes not what the cell is meant to be, but it just reproduces that same viral infectious material until the cell actually dies. And then when that happens, it releases more of that infectious material to continue the process elsewhere.
It's a good analogy.
It seems similar.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to pivot a little bit, I guess, into the Ukraine situation, because I wanted to get your thoughts on that. There's a lot of conflicting information. The propaganda is heavy now, and I'm seeing a lot of drums of war talk online, on Twitter, everywhere else. What are your thoughts on all of that and what's happening over there?
There's lots.
Yeah.
Well, I'll start by saying that I didn't see it coming. Like a lot of people, I think this was a boy who cried wolf situation with the Western intelligence agencies, right? Where for years they've been talking about Russian invasions, and they never come to pass, right? So the next time that they say, oh, there's a Russian invasion imminent, it's like, bullshit, not going to happen. And then, well, so the fact that it has happened made me wonder, oh, maybe they did have some actual intelligence that this was going on. But what strikes me the most is, there's a lot of propaganda, a lot of just hypocrisy that's going on. And I think it's very interesting to watch because in a sense it's very predictable, but at the same time it's predictable, but it's still a kind of surreal experience to watch it, because, and I think this just comes down to the tribal nature of people. So there have been how many wars in the last like 20 years, and specifically how many wars either involving the United States or NATO, or their allies. So I mean, we had Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen. We have, and then multiple military operations with bombings going on in other countries, and some wars that are still ongoing. Of like, just, I think it was just yesterday I saw, some meme of the active wars right now and the number of airstrikes in those wars. And so in Yemen, for instance, there were like, I don't know if it was like 100 airstrikes or something, and then the several dozen that were going on in Ukraine. And so I think that there's several things going on. One is just how much of a role media plays in what people think about and what people think is important to think about, and then the things they don't think about. But even if this is a question I have, if Yemen, for instance, were to get as much airplay as Ukraine is getting, of course, there's the novelty effect, right? The Ukraine war just started. The Yemen war has been going on for years, so no one really cares about Yemen anymore. But here's a new thing, so attention directed toward the new war. But look at the reactions that you've seen to what's going on, to the Russian invasion. It's like the impression that you get from looking at Western headlines, English-speaking headlines, not just English, is that this is like the worst thing to happen since World War II, and the greatest threat to Europe since World War II, the biggest military invasion, military attack since World War II, and look at how evil Russia is and how evil Putin is, and it's just terrible, and we have to stand with Ukraine, right? And then compare the reaction to that to the reaction to all of the American wars. So we can do a little whataboutism, and just say, okay, well, let's compare all these. Okay, so we should now sanction Russia, cut them off from the Western like economic architecture, and we should isolate them and do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then think, okay, well, what about Libya? What was the world's reaction to the invasion of Libya and the overthrowing of its government? And what were the justifications for that? What were the reasons given? Did they have anything to them? There's this weird, it's on the one hand, it's weird. On the other hand, it's just basic human hypocrisy, I think. And just the double standards that we feel, that we enact, because when someone does something we don't like, we're outraged. We're morally outraged. How could that person do something? And then one of our family members or we ourselves do it, and then we just justify it to ourselves, and we're outraged that anyone could be outraged that we're doing it.
Yeah.
And it's a total disconnect between even if there's a perfect equivalent between the things that we're doing, we can't see it in ourselves, and we can't criticize it in ourselves, but we'll go overboard in criticizing it in others. And I haven't read the book, but I was just listening to a podcast, and the name of a book came up, and it's like why we're all hypocrites or something, or no, why everyone else is a hypocrite except me. And so it's just kind of common to human nature, unfortunately, and but then the worst aspects of human nature have a tendency to be reinforced and then to be made even worse by propaganda. And that's just the nature of social living, I think. And you can see this in the kind of the Twitter effect or the social media effect, where people tend to congregate into, you know, their own echo chamber, where they're only looking at things from their point of view and not seeing it from others' point of view. And so this is kind of like, from my perspective, it's a totally unnecessary war, in the sense that it didn't have to happen if, for instance, the US hadn't staged a coup in 2014, and everything follows from that.
Yeah, that's what I'm noticing.
At least,
you know, there's so much black and white thinking now about this from the people who are just eating up the propaganda. It's like, if you don't immediately oppose Russia, or let me put it a different way, if you criticize NATO and if you criticize the Western powers in the EU in any way, you are automatically perceived by a lot of people now as you are now siding with Russia. And it's like, I don't think they understand that you can have a nuanced view of this. You don't have to view Russia as the bad guy to also then look at NATO and say, well, they're not good guys either. And that, I'm seeing a lot of that, you know, on Twitter and stuff like that.
Yeah, and there's this tendency, like, this isn't original to me. I saw it on Twitter somewhere, but some guy was pointing out that, okay, so for years you've been presumably believing that Russia is this evil dictatorship that wants to take over the entire world, and yet, okay, look what's happened in Ukraine. You've done nothing to actually prevent the possibility of, or the probability, or the certainty of Russia invading Ukraine, but seem to have done everything to facilitate it and to provoke it. So you would think that if you were dealing with someone that you knew was going to like, well, think about it this way. Let's say you're negotiating like a kind of hostage situation, and you're negotiating with someone that's planning to shoot you. Are you going to like bluff and bluster and provoke all in the expectation that this person's going to kill you, or are you going to try to negotiate and get yourself out of this horrible situation from this rabid killer who's going to, you know, rape and murder you? Well, if you're rational, you're going to try to survive. You're going to try to do things that to get yourself out of the situation, not to keep pushing them, not to refuse to listen to anything this rabid dog has to say. And the ironic thing is, or the funny thing is that it's not even a good analogy, because I don't think that that's totally true. I don't think that Russia should be seen in that light. I mean, there's a lot of reasons, like historical reasons. Like if you look at you know, people in Poland, they have their reasons for why they hate Russians, right? A lot of people have, the Western Ukrainians have their reasons for hating Russians. If you just look at their history, but you'd think that there would be, or maybe not, you'd hope that there would be a kind of rational approach where you at least pretend to take someone at their word, right? When you're in a negotiation with someone that you don't trust, you have to put a little bit forward, a little bit of trust forward, even if you don't think it's going to work, and then you see what happens. Right? You can trust someone and engage in, on the surface, good faith negotiations, and then see what happens. This was a problem. I'm reading this book on Julius Caesar, a recent book called Julius Caesar and the Roman People by Morstein Marx. I can't remember his first name. And he's talking about the conflict between Pompey and Caesar. And he analyzes it in terms, well, he's got an appendix where he looks at it in terms of game theory. And he uses game theory as just kind of a framework to understand and to present what was going on in this conflict between Caesar and Pompey. And I see like big similarities between like the West and Russia when looked at in these terms, and how this kind of like increasing distrust, the more you distrust the other side, the less likely either side is going to make a concession. Now, in the case of Caesar and Pompey, Caesar continued to make concessions and to bring forward to bring forward new concessions and to bring forward new proposals for peace, new proposals to stave off this eventual war, and presumably Pompey and the people surrounding him had, some of them had such a deep distrust of Caesar that they interpreted what he was doing as these aggressive moves and just wouldn't accept any negotiations, any inch that Caesar was willing to give, until civil war became inevitable. And it actually, Marx argues that we have a misunderstanding of the crossing the Rubicon, that wasn't actually the moment where civil war was inevitable and Caesar crossed the Rubicon and decided, okay, we're going to have to go to war. That was kind of an after the fact explanation of what happened, after the fact kind of literary description of what he must have been thinking when he crossed the Rubicon, just because it was an iconic moment that had resonances with the classics at the time, like their histories and their myths of the significance of crossing the river, crossing the boundary. But when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he still didn't see civil war as inevitable. And there, I think it was for months after crossing the Rubicon, he was still open to negotiations and staving off this war. Now there are parallels to what's been going on with Russia and Russia and NATO and the US, where you see these two sides that don't trust each other, and from each perspective have reason not to trust each other. And yet when one side continues to bring forward their conditions, or even their concessions they're willing to make, the problem is that, well, there's a lot of propaganda around it, but the way I see it is that, like in this case, NATO and the US have been pretty much Pompeii in this situation, that they have not made an effort to see the perspective of the other side and to take them at their word. And
this was what I was
and from
saying.
The Russian side,
this is what I was saying too, is that people don't want to look at it from the other side, in the sense that, a nation is going to act in its self-interest almost always, and it shouldn't be a surprise to people that Russia is going to do something that acts in its own self-interest. I'm not saying it justifies the invasion or anything like that. I'm just saying you need to put these things in context. But flip it around. Imagine the situation were different. Imagine Russia all of a sudden came into Canada and annexed a part of Canada and was now like hugging right next to the United States border. I think, people in America would react in a similar sort of way as the Russians are reacting. And, it helps to put things in that perspective. But, with the propagandized, as soon as you start talking in that way, it's automatically you're an apologist for Putin, or you're justifying all these things and et cetera. You're on his side or whatever. They can't look at the nuance. People who are propagandized, the nuance is lost on them. Reason flies out the window, and everything becomes black and white. You're with us or against us.
Mm-hmm. And then everything becomes interpreted in the light of the way you're already seeing things. So the fact that Russia invaded proved that they were always going to invade, and that they've wanted to invade since 1989 or 1991, and that they've finally got the chance to do it.
And then these folks act like it happened in a vacuum, like there wasn't all these other factors that led up to this. Like you mentioned the coup in 2014. Maybe you could talk a bit about that and what actually happened in Ukraine in 2014 that kind of set the stage for this.
I don't know if I want to get too much into those details, but basically I think the long and short of it is the CIA sort of sponsored a coup and installed neo-Nazis. I think that's pretty much as far into it as we want to get.
Yeah, I will say, for anyone that wants the depth, the best book that I've found on it is Gordon Hahn's Ukraine Over the Edge. It's a big book. I think it's something like 500 pages, and they're big pages. So he goes in I just think it's the best book. It's got all the history in it. It's got everything. I think the book was written or published probably around 3 years ago, but still relevant, and you can 2018. Yeah. So you can still use it to understand what's been going on and what's been happening. With all that background, and the section on the neo-Nazi battalions and groups. I can't remember which one he focuses on. Right sector, probably. Right sector for sure, and then there's a couple others, I think. But he's got a section where he goes into them and reads their actual documents, their actual propaganda, and it's a really good. Even just those 4 or 5 pages are a really good case study in like Ponerology, and what Lobaczewski talks about as like what he calls a ponerogenic union, basically a small group that is, what's the best way to put it, infected by, a small political group infected by evil. And you can see the psychopathology of these neo-Nazi battalions and the groups that form them. And of course, so yeah, just to relate it back to Ponerology.
No, I think that's kind of like what I think has been the best part of the conversation, is that a lot of people, and one of the things we talk a lot about Ponerology and psychopathology and how they can impact people on the macrosocial level. One thing we haven't addressed is possible solutions. So one of the things that Lobaczewski said, is that you shouldn't attempt to cure a disease that you don't understand. It's like one of the very basic principles of medicine. And so that's why I like to talk about Ponerology and, cluster B disorders and all these things, is because the awareness of these conditions and to truly grok and understand them at a deep level is not something that's occurring at a wide enough scale, planetary, among the general population. So that, and I think if we get there, I think the idea is that the way to treat this problem is to have sort of a critical mass awareness of what's causing it. And that's why I think Ponerology is so important. Conversations like these are really important. I'm so happy that you guys put another version of the book together that's going to be a little bit easier to understand with more information, because that was the Achilles heel of the original edition, is that it was clunky, it was difficult to understand.
There was a barrier.
There was definitely a barrier there, especially, you'd have to be really interested in reading and psychology and to really get into it.
Yeah, it could be dry too, so you have to really be willing to trudge through books like that for the sake of getting information. I'm a book nerd, so I'm like crazy excited for the new edition. And I love footnotes galore. I love that stuff.
So what do you think is the
Great, you'll love it then. Well, I think you kind of nailed what Lobaczewski's main solution is. I'll relate this back to the idea of the dynamics of the dynamics of evil being the same at every level. It's the same thing works with the solutions. So Lobaczewski gives examples of of patients of his and the way he'd work with them. And when you have a situation like Josh Slocum's, where, for instance, a child has been raised by a borderline mother, or you can use any other combination, a child raised by any kind of personality disordered parent, or even an adult having a relationship or an interaction with another who's personality disordered, whether it's a family member, a spouse, a child, or a work colleague or a boss. In any of these situations, the problem is that the person doesn't understand what's happening. And it's when they are thrown into this situation, or when they've been living in it for years, there's just no frame of reference to understand what was going on, either to compare it to normal and to realize that it wasn't normal, or to understand why it's so out of the ordinary and abnormal. There's this barrier to understanding because it's just not within a person's frame of reference to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
And so what Lobaczewski found is that in the therapeutic process, just explaining to a person what's going on, just giving them the basic facts about personality disorders, it has a curative effect. It has a healing effect. And that's why I like Josh Slocum's show and his story so much, is that he's a perfect representation or manifestation of that phenomenon. When he found out about narcissistic and borderline personality disorders, all of a sudden his entire childhood made sense. His mother made sense. And that was a huge healing moment for him that he acknowledges and that he talks about repeatedly. Well, so what Lobaczewski found and what he argues.
I'm thinking. I keep thinking of Yeonmi Park kept coming to my head, and she's reminding me of, I guess, a more macro social example of this. But she was from North Korea, and she did an interview with Jordan Peterson and a couple other people recently. But she describes her experience of growing up there and how she didn't even know that there was another way for societies to be until she was able to get out of North Korea and knew what actual freedom was outside of that really strict authoritarian type of system, which you could view, you know, as the individual's relationship to the government is like you're in a relationship with an abusive parent in a sense. And that's how an authoritarian government behaves, is they behave like that, like an abusive parent, a crazy parent, you know.
Oh, guys, I lost you.
Oh no, you're still here.
Oh, you're back.
We're back. We
had a little hiccup there.
It's okay. It's okay. But yeah, so I was, the whole time you were talking, I kept thinking of her and her describing that revelation that she had just from leaving North Korea and realizing like, wow, oh my God, this is what normal life outside of a really harsh authoritarian country and relationship with the government is like.
Mm-hmm. So Lobaczewski argues that the main thing, the first thing that needs to be done and to be achieved is what Brent was just saying about that critical mass of understanding, where if everyone were to listen to Josh's podcast or to read this book, if this kind of information were to somehow become popularized, where it was common knowledge, that would in to a large degree like neuter these ability or these processes, like kind of nip them in the bud. That's one thing, and because the dynamic is the same, the explanation for what happens or what is happening is healing and gives a person an understanding of what's going on. So kind of like the individual you're talking about, I can't remember her name, Lobaczewski talks about, about a couple of his patients, one of whom was an ex-concentration camp inmate, and who had problems at home, problems as a parent raising her children, or her daughter, I think it was, and how by giving her hints about the nature of the political system he couldn't speak too openly, that she got it, she understood it, and that in itself had a healing effect on the psychological problems that she and others were having as a result of living under the system. And so that was specifically for people living within a full-blown pathocracy. And just like, you'll hear a lot of people say that if you haven't lived under it, then you can't understand it. And that's true to a large degree. For people that didn't live in under the various forms of totalitarianism in the 20th century, for those that didn't live under that, they don't understand it, and a lot of them probably can't understand it. It's just totally outside of their realm of experience.
And Yeonmi Park's example was the opposite of that. She never knew what it was like to be in a non-authoritarian, totally authoritarian society. Like that was foreign to her. She didn't realize that societies could even be any other way than the way they were in North Korea.
It's also interesting because one of the things that we're noticing now is that we are finding people from China, people that from ex-Soviet bloc countries that immigrated here with their families in the mid 20th century or late 20th century. They are warning like everyone that they talk to,
Lily
that
Tang.
They're seeing the resurgence of these similar patterns that kind of, that what they left their home country for, they're starting to see it here in the United States and in Canada.
On that note,
Yep.
I think Canada is kind of the subject we should end on. You, Harrison, you're Canadian, although you are no longer in Canada.
Yes, I am.
Yes. So I think it is appropriate for us to discuss those things as well. And I think that's probably the best topic for us to end on. So, what do you think is going on over there, and how do you think this is going to play out? I'm hoping most of our listeners already kind of have the basic details of the convoy and the emergency powers and those sorts of things. But I don't know. What do you think? Are Trudeau's days numbered, or is it going to get worse? Is he going to clamp down?
I'm terrible at predictions. I have no idea what's going to happen, except the only prediction I'd be willing to make is that whatever does happen, things will continue to get worse. Because I don't see any trends of them indicating that they will get better, that they can get better. For some reason, Canada is at the forefront of Western nations unwittingly on the part of the majority and unknowingly going down this totalitarian path And I say that like not even realizing it. Now, of course, there are some people that realize it because the political psychopaths are always aware of these things and can see the direction things are going, and even, you know, have a hand in pushing them along. But the vast majority of people have no idea what's going on. They're going along with it. In a sense, it's kind of like, I read Machiavelli recently. We're gonna publish a show on Machiavelli pretty soon, and you can admire what's going on in Canada as just genius from an evil point of view, and not just Canada. To greater or lesser degrees, it's been going on across the entire planet with that which shall not be named.
I just call it. I call it the new normal bullshit. We should just call it that. We don't even have to acknowledge the virus.
So the new normal bullshit, where it's the perfect hijacking of normal human psychology. We recorded another show recently where we read Norman Doidge's article, Needle Points, and commented on needle points. And he talks about this thing called the behavioral immune system. And it's this tendency when you think other people might have an infectious disease to then essentially go to the point of demonizing them because they're potentially infectious, not even definitely infectious, but potentially infectious. And that creates this like rock hard barrier between you and that person, and that other person becomes the enemy. And this mentality is present on both sides of the new normal to greater or lesser degrees, and has created this perfect justification for the introduction of a new normal. And so I can look at a lot of my colleagues and friends and family and the things that they write about what's going on, you know, like on Facebook. And I can see that, you know, if I put myself in their position, I can see that it more or less makes sense. You know, I can see, okay, you know, I can see where they're coming from. I can see, you know, why they're saying that when I adopt their position, even if I totally disagree with it for other reasons. But what they don't realize is that to a large degree, that's irrelevant. That by seeing things only in terms of the most obvious, they're completely blind to the ulterior motives that can, and I would argue are, being injected into this phenomenon. Because you can take over a country, you can turn a country into a pathocracy using the truth. It's just how you use it. And I'm not saying that that's what they are doing, but to a large degree, that's the way it happens. So you can take, I'm just saying this for the sake of argument. You can, even if we accept that everything is exactly the way the official narrative has been, everything about that has been true, even when it changes, all the changes have been true as well, that's irrelevant. That even if that were the case, it's possible to use a situation like that to create a new structure that then facilitates the emergence of this kind of, like in this case, leftist totalitarianism. And and it just shows how willing people are to give up. You know, it sounds like a cliche to give up their freedoms in the face of you know, what they perceive to be something scary. But the ironic thing is like those people that you mentioned, Brent, like the Chinese, the Eastern Europeans, the people who have lived through this, you know, the North Koreans that come here and say, I'm seeing the same shit going down. Like them, oh, I lost my train of thought, but
happens all the time to me.
Like them, there is this, oh, I really want to get it back. I have to get back on that train. That,
no big deal.
And it's gone.
So okay, let me just no. Let me trace back what I was saying. So like we're going on this this journey, right? And we're unaware of it. Oh yeah, so we lose this. So we lose our sense of freedom. We lose the importance of freedom. But the thing is that once we've lost it and the new normal becomes the new normal, like in all reality, then a lot of these people are going to be like, look back and say, oh, shit, now I understand why it would have been so important, or why it was so important to try to preserve this thing that at the time seemed so ephemeral and so unimportant in the face of this big danger. Because I think probably, I'm going to try to go for an aphorism here, probably the most important things in the long run, and even in the short run, like in our everyday lives, are the things that are least obvious. And those are the things that we're most likely to shunt aside in the face of what we perceive as this big and obvious problem. And it's that weakness of being able to see the importance of the unseen things, these implicit things that hold human life together, that hold our relationships together and hold our society together, is that when we lose sight of that, and we have that weakness in the face of something that's blunt and concrete and in front of us, if it is blunt and concrete, it doesn't have to be, then we're giving up everything that, like all of those like little unconscious decisions that have been collected into like the thing we call society for generations and for hundreds and even thousands of years. We just will throw that aside because we can't see its importance, and then we're essentially opening the doors to our own destruction. And that's what happened. That's what has happened historically. That's what Ponerology is about. That's the warning, is that when we do that, and when we're unaware of these processes going on that are our own fault, for being weak, for being for not seeing what's going on, we are the ones opening the door for this Trojan horse. And then we really will have no one but ourselves to blame when, in the future we look back and say, oh, well, I was just so scared for my life and for the lives of the people I love. It's like, well, sometimes you have to take into account more than just one issue.
Yeah, you don't know what
most of the time you have to.
Don't know what you got until it's gone is a big problem. But also, one of the things that Lobaczewski talks about that we kind of touched on, but a little bit, was the hystericization of society, making people more hysterical over a threat. In Nazi Germany, it was the Jews and the gypsies and the homosexuals and everybody that didn't fit in. He drummed up the threat that had to the stability of society. And now, with the new normal, we have the coof and
the unjabbed.
And we're sort of creating like this mass hysteria surrounding that. But interestingly, that narrative sort of has kind of collapsed more or less. We've seen a lot of data coming out that is counter to that, between insurance companies reporting new claims, between Pfizer trying to hide data. We have a lot of interesting little data points that we're just starting to bubble up and come to the surface, that we're taking that whole narrative apart, and then bam, now we have this, war, Ukraine, it's this whole thing. And it's just like, everybody quick, look over here.
Yep.
And it's just like, I'm just like, now people are getting hysterical over Ukraine, and they don't seem to realize the inherent danger of that hysteria in and of itself, and that emotional fervor.
And that the media will channel it from thing to thing, especially if they need to divert your attention away from something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of those tricky things about human psychology. And it's one of those things, this is one of the ideas that weaves in and out of Ponerology, is that I don't think we've really talked about it yet, is that psychopaths are, just like they observe the emotions and they learn how to mimic emotions, they are kind of pseudo experts at human psychology. They know what pushes our buttons, and they know how to use that to manipulate us. So just how to put this? So with mass hysteria can happen on its own without the involvement of any psychopaths. But psychopaths observing this know how it works and know how to weaponize it for their own purposes. So you've always got to look at things from kind of two points of view. One being that, okay, this is the way humans operate, and this is kind of normal. And then also, how can this be used and manipulated, and how might it be being used and to manipulate us? Yeah. So this is the thing that people, this goes back to my point about Canada, that a lot of Canadians are, I would say, kind of hopelessly naive about, that they don't consider that. They don't consider that something that they think of as good and necessary might also be being used by bad actors, people who don't have their best interests at heart, people who have an agenda. And that seems to be, that for me, that should kind of always be part of any equation when talking about anything involving humans in groups or individuals. Yeah. We have to be skeptical, and especially about politicians.
Yes.
It's funny because it's one of the things I was watching your last episode of MindMatters, and one of the things you brought up was the pervasiveness of lies in politics, and how everybody sort of understands that politicians are liars and thieves and cheats. But when you start to point out the fact that, we know that, but maybe they're lying and cheating and stealing about this particular issue, maybe we should, consider that. They're like, oh no, that can't be happening. No, they're totally being honest about this thing. I'm just like,
well, what you were saying too made me think of one of the debates around the origins of the coof, of the virus. And I think, yes, the question of whether or not it was manufactured, well, we know pretty certain now that it was definitely manufactured. I think the real question that people grapple with, especially in the conspiracy realm, is, was it released on purpose or did it get out by accident? And I think ultimately that question is less important than the things you're saying, because what it comes down to is whether the crisis was manufactured or just happened. These types of folks are going to take advantage of it and use it for the types of things that we're seeing them use it for. So yeah, in some situations a crisis will arise. They didn't create it, the people in power, but they see it as the perfect opportunity to do certain things that they've been wanting to do. And then maybe in another situation, they're like, well, we need a crisis right now, so create one and then do the things that you're trying to do and use it to justify it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a lot of people aren't aware of just how devious some of these things can be, and just how devious psychopaths can be. Like, you read some of these stories and you just extrapolate that to the level of politics, and it becomes, you can become pretty cynical and jaded, but at the same time, it's kind of required to at least have that realistic, practical approach to looking at these kinds of things. That it's not loony to think that there are some really shady people out there, and that are involved in these kinds of things.
Yeah, it's very bizarre, especially when you consider, Jeffrey Epstein and the whole Epstein affair. And, it shows us that these types of people can exist. They can have access to incredible amounts of resources. They can get away with their crimes for long periods of time, and also, navigate or avoid the justice system because they have connections to, political, politicians, billionaires, royalty, and intelligence agencies. And the justice apparatus is also compromised because it took forever. And then what happened to Epstein? Before he got to trial, conveniently he was killed. And then recently, Jean-Luc Brunel was also found dead by hanging, which I thought was just it is almost like the people that killed Epstein also killed him and did it in the same exact way, just so that they could leave a calling card in that same way that your typical serial killer will leave that kind of calling card. And
part of this,
it just shows, it reminds me of how that pathology can exist across, in very wealthy and in extreme amounts of power.
Part of this, though, I think, is normal folks, everyday folks, they don't want to believe that their leaders could possibly be capable of doing things this evil on this scale, doing things like, raping kids and selling them and maybe creating a virus and releasing it on people. They can't conceive of that. And maybe they can conceive of it, but I think part of it is they simply don't want to allow themselves to believe that, because once you do, it really changes your entire worldview, and you have to approach life differently.
The world becomes a much darker place.
And maybe you might have to say something about it or do something about it, God forbid. And that's a huge responsibility. And it's also just a frightening, scary thought. Who wants to think that, wow, my leaders are crazy, evil psychopaths who will basically do whatever they want to get power, to keep power, and they will use me and throw me away for it. It's just, we want to believe these people care about us, I think. And it goes back to that point I made, where people with a conscience want to believe everyone has one, and that there's a little bit of good in everyone, that they're looking out for us. I think even some of the Q people, that's what they were falling for. Like, oh, there's a secret group in the government conspiring to take down the evil psychopaths. And it's like, no, that's not happening, guys.
Yeah, no.
Well, I think on that note, Harrison, do you have any final thoughts that you want to express before we wrap it up?
I don't think so. I'll just repeat some of the information that you gave about me at the beginning. So if you want to look for Mind Matters, one word, on YouTube and on wherever you get podcasts. We're also on Odyssey. That's kind of just a backup channel so that we have all our videos archived. And the new edition, there's no release date yet, but I'm hoping that we can have it published, like fingers crossed, like in a month, maybe. So like maybe end of March. But we'll make more definite announcements as that time approaches. So, yeah. But yeah, other than that, I want to thank you guys. It was a fun interview. We talked about a lot.
Yeah, it was a great conversation.
What's up?
Once you have the link for sale of the new edition, I'll throw it into the description for the pod. I'll update it.
Yeah, we'll probably
even when it's out, people can just
maybe we'll do a follow-up discussion too, and we'll see. But we're definitely going to be promoting the book, and it's a book we talk about as often as we can on the show. And I think you're probably the most qualified person we've had this discussion with about these things. So thanks for joining us, man. Seriously, we appreciate it.
Cool. Yeah, anytime. And I'd love to come on again when the book's out. And who knows, maybe you could even have someone else on with me. We could have a whole fun thing with it.
We could read some sections from it and stuff like that. But
don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, share this video with your friends, and we will be back again soon with another one. Thanks for watching, guys.
Bye-bye.